that for a slice of fried gold?
Yeah, boy!
Have you checked the children?
You're one of us.
I'm not gonna hurt you. I'm just gonna bash your brains.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
I'd buy that for $1.
There's no more room in hell. The dead will walk here.
We all go a little mad sometimes.
I guess everyone's entitled to one good scare.
It is weird, like somebody's reaching up and grabbing your chest.
It's,
And/or
it is
giving you a beach. It's Weird Al giving you a beach. What a way to start an episode. Well, hello, and welcome to Cinema Shock. This is a podcast devoted to exploring the stories behind Gary Horn. Accurate.
I'm a butt guest.
What the hell are you talking about right now?
You said you're butt one. I'm a
Oh my
butt
God.
one too.
and that is why we refer to him as writer comedian Todd Davis,
Oh God.
special guest for this episode.
I
Welcome
believe
back,
maybe
Todd.
that's why we're the only ones who refer to him.
Yeah.
And I am your other co-host, Justin Bishop.
You can't see it, but Justin always puts air quotes around writer comedian.
Every time. Welcome to week 4 of our. I need to start putting show numbers on these because I keep forgetting how many of these we're doing. We're not even halfway through this series, guys.
Hey.
We are on episode 4 of our exploration of the careers of George Romero and Tom Savini, specifically the films that they collaborated on, which is a lot. They did a lot together, which is why we're doing this. It's a lot of fun. So
Yeah.
this is week 4. You guys, which is why we're doing this. It's a lot of fun. So
Yeah.
this is week 4. You guys happy to be here? You guys don't look very happy to be here.
No, I'm very happy to be
Todd,
here.
you're first of all, you're wearing a hoodie.
Yeah, I'm
And
comfy.
it is-
It's comfy
is-
cozy.
It is 90 degrees outside.
Is it?
You will notice.
It feels
I am
chilly
not,
in the room I'm in.
I'm not outside.
You're wearing a hoodie over your head with your headphones over the hoodie.
I have
It's like 75. I just looked this up.
I was exaggerating, Gary. It's still
I'm
too
rocking
warm.
some bedhead. Some,
Oh, yeah,
Exaggerating
some-
is like going up by 2 or 3 degrees. You just said 90. It's 75. That is a huge jump.
This is irrelevant. This is
My
irrelevant.
imagination takes me to a whole other place. When
This is irrelevant. The point is that it's too warm for Todd to be wearing a hoodie. That's my point.
Well, if it helps, I'm not wearing a t-shirt underneath it.
Or
so
pants
it's-
or underwear. He is Pooh Bear to be wearing a hoodie. That's my point.
Well, if it helps, I'm not wearing a t-shirt underneath it.
Or
so
pants
it's-
or underwear. He is Pooh Bearing it.
Yeah. Listen, there's no better way to podcast.
This is
Then I'm
quality
gonna start
podcast.
calling it my pudcast, because that's
Jesus.
hands on the pud the whole time.
The
Welcome to the
Pull on my
podcast,
pud.
everybody.
We're going to be
Wow.
talking about effects and pulling on my pud.
Oh man. So let's get into it, guys. So we touched on this a little bit last week, but one of Savini's most famous gore effects, one of the most famous gags from Dawn of the Dead, which we talked about last week, is the death of what is referred to as the screwdriver zombie. All the zombies in that movie have names based on what's killing them, etc.
Do you think the screwdriver zombie died, became a zombie because of the screwdriver, or was that just like part of the way through somebody stabbed the zombie with a screwdriver?
Well, no, he gets stabbed in the head as a zombie with a screwdriver.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
We talked
Okay,
about this
right.
last week, right?
Yeah,
we
we
talked
did.
about it because that was one of the gags that Savini had to improvise on set because it was a continuity issue and they had to figure it out.
The
So
first guy they tried it with completely failed. So go back to last week if you want to hear more about that story.
I'm thirsty for a screwdriver.
Oh my God, Todd.
Mm.
Writer comedian Todd Davis, everyone.
Thank you. Available for parties and bar mitzvahs and corporate events
Not kids' parties. He's not allowed anymore.
No, he
No.
was banned.
because of the podcast.
So we talked about this during Dawn of the Dead, that a lot of the zombies and a lot of the cast members in general were played by friends of the crew, friends of George Romero's, and the same was the case. Production company, not unlike Romero's, called Romero's company, the Latent Image, called the Image Works. It's a very similar concept where they were basically doing industrial films, commercials, shooting video for the local public access channel. They worked on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, just like George Romero did. So they worked together for a few years, and this partnership eventually led to them doing a feature film, and that's the film that we're going to be talking about today. Originally supposed to be released, I should say, I guess, in 1979, a movie called Effects.
Okay, let's see a movie.
Nobody is going to believe a spurt of blood.
They'll believe anything we show them.
She's pretty good with that razor, huh? You gotta put her in the movie.
Well, I still don't know what to do when he comes in.
No, you're fine. You're stoned. You're confused. Besides, everything's happening too fast for you to even be scared.
It's trash.
You're confused. Besides, everything's happening too fast for you to even be scared.
It's trash. Killing somebody on film? It's sick.
Not FX.
Nope. Tried that one already.
No, different movie.
Yep. Their company used to be called Badada.
Budadu.
Whatever.
I think it was Budadu. Yes,
but you can see it on the clapboard in the kitchen, like when it's there. It says.
Yeah. You can. There are clips from some of their on the Blu-ray of Effects that was released by AGFA. There are a couple of their short films on it, and they are copyright Budadu or Babadu or Babadook or whatever it's called. They wisely changed it to the Image Works later on, which is probably a good move on their part.
Yeah. Most of Hollywood would be having that exact.
They changed it to the Image Works later on, which is probably a good move on their part.
Yeah. Most of Hollywood would be having that exact same conversation.
Yes, I mean, because we can't remember it right now, so why will anyone else remember your gibberish name like Psychotronic?
Yeah, garbage.
So while these guys are shooting commercials, industrials, documentaries, etc., they also started working on these short films, like the ones I mentioned that are on that Blu-ray. And some of these short films they were just kind of doing them for fun, but some of them are pretty bizarre. The ones that are on that AGFA Blu-ray are strange, and to the point where you can see these guys working in horror. You know, they're not specifically horror films, but they definitely have. These guys had horror movie sensibilities, right? And it was during this time that they met George Romero. So Romero loved their short film, so that he kind of asked them to start working with him. And this was during this stint that we talked. Romero loved their short film, so that he kind of asked them to start working with him. And this was during this stint that we talked about at the beginning of our Martin episode, where Romero was taking a break from feature filmmaking. He was working on sports documentaries, etc., like The Juice on the Loose and things like that. So he asked the Image Work guys to start helping him out with some of these gigs. So he would send them out on the road to film for these sports documentaries. Sometimes he'd go with them, sometimes not. But it was sort of a partnership between Romero and the Image Works. And they developed a working relationship, but they also developed a friendship. So when it came time for Romero to start, when he decided he wanted to make another feature film, he had this idea for Martin. He asked him to come along and work with it on it. We discussed in the Martin episode, if you haven't listened to that, it's 2 episodes back. The creation of that film is pretty interesting because it's very sort of lo-fi, low-budge, almost guerrilla filmmaking, which is something we're kind of going to talk about in this episode too. But one thing we mentioned, and that crew member was Pasquale Buba. Or Pat Buba, as his friends refer to him as, which I'm probably going to refer to him as because it's a lot easier to say. So we mentioned how the cast and crew, several of them lived in that house, and they would all hang out in that house. And the mother of this crew member would feed them like family-style Italian food, you know, like your typical Italian grandmother type, feeding everyone. And that was Pat Buba's mother. His brother Tony also worked on Martin. He was the sound engineer for that film.
Yeah, they said that the grandmother was talking with her hands and putting O at the end of every sentence, just the typical Italian grandmother.
Writer comedian Tom Davis, everyone.
Part of what's fun about this is all these guys are going to be tied to
event.
Romero for forever.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Very true.
These guys are going to be
your
tied to
event.
Romero for forever.
Yeah, Very
So-
true. I mean, that's kind of what's interesting about this episode, and the reason we wanted to do it, even though Romero didn't really have anything to do with the making of this movie. All of these guys have connections to Romero, and they all met on, or they didn't meet, but they all worked with Romero on the set of Martin. The only one of them that actually has any kind of credit is Pat Buba. He's credited as drug dealer number 2, which I assume is in the scene where Martin bursts into that, what looks like just a den of people shooting up and shit, and the cops burst in that scene. I assume it's that scene, but he was drug dealer number 2. His brother Tony was drug dealer number 1. They both get shot, I believe, in the film. But all of these guys were on the set at one time or another, all kind of learning from Romero. He was probably about a decade older than them. So they kind of looked up to him as this like Pittsburgh filmmaker who sort of made it big, because he hadn't made it big like he would with Dawn of the Dead because he hadn't filmed that yet, but he created Night of the Living Dead and kind of put Pittsburgh on the map as a place where movies could be made.
Well, as you start to, if anybody's, for whatever reason, like discovered this show, and it's maybe you're just starting your love for film. If you have a favorite film, like look into that director and their career. Odds are you're going to see a lot of this same type of relationships where they worked with some folks early on, and those folks hung around for 5, 10, 20 years or more.
Yeah,
it's always fun to see, like, even as big and as corporate as those movies can get, at the end of the day, it's still a lot of friends getting together to make these things, just like our show.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one thing that's so looking for connections. You start finding connections. You start finding ways that these guys are connected to, a movie we might talk about, 6 months from now or 2 years from now. There are going to be connections between episodes that we did a long time ago. And, it's really interesting and really fun. And it really, the filmmaking world is huge, but there are these kind of small family units a lot of times. And what Romero was doing in Pittsburgh was a even smaller version of that, because it is such a tight-knit community. It kind of reminds me of the what they refer to as the Michigan Mafia, I think is what they call it, which is Sam Raimi and Sam Raimi and the Coen brothers and Bruce Campbell, all those guys who were making movies together when they were young. And of course,
I forgot they had that moniker. Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people don't realize that Sam Raimi, this guy responsible for movies like Darkman and The Evil Dead and Army of Darkness. Sam Raimi, this guy responsible for movies like Darkman and The Evil Dead and Army of Darkness, is also very closely connected to the Coen brothers, who make completely different kind of movies. But the Coen brothers wrote an early movie for Sam Raimi, and they worked together for years and years. And it's just kind of, it's really fun seeing like the family tree aspect of all of this.
Mm-hmm.
If this movie is any indication of what the behind the scenes is actually like for these, then that scene in Martin where Buba's playing drug dealer number 2, that wasn't actually like directed. That was just the behind the scenes.
They just everyone's just doing coke.
Right, exactly. Hey, how about you cool off my nose? Yeah, let me film it.
So these guys are working on Martin, and they get kind of inspired to do their own feature-length film. So another friend of the crew, a guy named William H. Mooney. So William Mooney had written a subsequent screenplay, were inspired by a kind of a fairly recent urban legend, which is the snuff film. Now, for listeners who may not know the term, a snuff film is essentially a movie that allegedly shows an actual murder or sometimes an actual suicide, usually circulated for profit.
Or as Todd calls them, home movies.
But that's a different podcast altogether.
So the first known use of the term snuff movie is in a 1971 book by Ed Sanders called The Family. It's a great title, by the way.
Yeah. Holy shit.
Wait, that wasn't it. It wasn't just The Family. I'm not done. There's a subtitle to this.
Oh.
The Family, the story of Charles Manson's Dune Buggy Attack Battalion. And in that book, the author, Ed Sanders, alleges that the Manson family made snuff movies, or at least made a snuff movie, The Attack Battalion. And in that book, the author, Ed Sanders, alleges that the Manson family made snuff movies, or at least made a snuff movie. So the concept of the snuff movie, though, if not the name necessarily, goes back much further than that, pretty much to the beginning of cinema. There was always sort of the urban legend that there are these movies being circulated where people are getting killed on film. The concept of the snuff film being made for profit and being distributed with those with, let's say, severely fucked up tastes. That kind of began with a 1976 movie called Snuff. So Snuff was a low-budget exploitation horror movie directed by Michael and Roberta Findlay. So that movie, it was originally called Slaughter. It was just a kind of low-budget, forgettable horror movie. But then a distributor by the name of Alan Shackleton came along. He was an exploitation Slaughter. It was just a kind of low-budget, forgettable horror movie. But then a distributor by the name of Alan Shackleton came along. He was an exploitation movie distributor, and like many, he sensationalized his film. So he comes along, he buys the film, and he had read about the story of like these snuff films being imported from South America, and he decided to kind of exploit that idea by giving the movie a new title. He retitled it Snuff, and he had the director shoot a new ending where an actress, a woman who was not a character in the movie, but an actress, appears to be murdered on a film set.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and this Shackleton guy was a hell of a character. He was the kind of guy who, what he did for this movie is he marketed it as if it were an actual snuff film. Like he led people to believe this is, kind of pre Blair Witch, I guess, where, I mean, obviously this is 2 decades prior to Blair. And he even hired protesters. He paid people to picket and protest the movie outside of theaters to drum up publicity. And the movie opened to like lines around the block. And it was this big cultural thing.
That's awesome.
Very brief, but it also gave birth to like a widespread urban legend of these snuff movies actually existing.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is, I know we've joked about tangents here, but if I could divert for just a second, I think it speaks to the nature of man, of like what we're willing to spend our hard-earned money to actually witness, as opposed to, if somebody was just like, hey, I've made this kids movie and it's educational and nobody gives a shit. Yeah. But if you're like, hey, I want to watch somebody get brutally murdered.
Yeah, I mean, that's
real,
what Faces of Death was successful for that very reason. And most of that was fake. But on what inspired this novel and the ultimate screenplay was the idea, because you do see a video in this movie, which we'll, I'm sure, talk about in a minute, that is purportedly one of those snuff movies. So with a story to be ready to be filmed, it was time to raise some cash. Now, this was pre-credit card, so they couldn't go the Kevin Smith route and just like max out all their credit cards to pay for the movie like he did. They couldn't do that. So they basically had to go door to door asking friends and family for money to finance the film. Or more accurately, they started selling them shares of the film for $1,000 a piece.
Oh, wow.
And they did it. They raised money. They didn't raise a lot of money, but they raised about $55,000, which is, a very small budget for a movie, but it was enough to get a movie made.
Yeah.
So now with,
they've got nice friends and family. Like everybody that does this, it's just, I don't know. I feel like I could go to my dad and be like, hey, if you give me $1,000, you could have a part in the
shares. And it's like, hey, you own in this case, 1/55th of this movie. So this movie goes on to make $1 million. You've made a little bit of cash back,
Yeah.
So that's kind of how it works. That did not happen with this movie. So it's time to get a cast together. So both Joe Pilato and Susan Chapek, you guys probably recognize Joe Pilato if you're familiar with some later Romero movies, specifically the one we're going to be talking about in a couple of weeks. But these guys, they're primarily stage actors. Joe Pilato was employed by the Pittsburgh City Theater. He essentially worked for the city government, but putting on plays at the City Theater. And Chapek was a more recent Pittsburgh transplant who actually founded and helped to run a small theater with some friends there in Pittsburgh as well. So they're stage actors. They're not necessarily your typical exploitation movie actors, you know. They were skilled actors. I mean, Chapek was a Shakespearean, like, trained actress. Like, they're stage actors. They're not necessarily your typical exploitation movie actors, you know. They were skilled actors. I mean, Chapek was a Shakespearean, like, trained actress. Like, she had a lot of experience coming into this movie, which makes the scene where she's like quoting Shakespeare, I think, and she's doing a sonnet into the mirror, gives that a little bit more meaning, you know, because that was her background.
Yeah, reading a little bit about Pilato too. Like, he was a transplant out of Boston, I think, originally, and had been working in theater there and moved to Pittsburgh because of the scene or something. I think he was living or something where now it's like an Andy Warhol museum or something. I was reading some interviews. It's kind of interesting about that.
Wow.
And I think the performances, especially their two performances in this movie, for a movie like this, which is a very low budget, you know, very cheap horror movie, exploitation movie, the performances by the two, what I would consider that's really good, because there's a naturalism to them that is very different from what you normally get in these types of movies, which is sort of bad or over the top acting, you know, or just plain, you know, crummy acting. But I think they're really good, especially those two. I mean, there are other good performances in the film, but I think those two especially are very good in this. And I think that probably is due to their experience on stage. But I think it adds a lot to the film, because this movie most movies like this would very well have employed less experienced actors in these roles.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And especially Pilato, because if you like most people like me, if you're mostly familiar with him from Day of the Dead, he gives a very different performance here. He is very over the top in Day of the Dead in a great way, but he plays a very kind of natural, very down to earth. It's a very down to earth It's a very down to earth performance here, I think.
Yeah, I think this is, in terms of just the acting alone, I think this is actually head and shoulders above Martin.
I would not disagree with that.
Yeah, I think they do a great job.
And then John Harrison. So John Harrison, we mentioned earlier, is one of the guys from the Image Works who founded that. Well, he got cast in the film as Lacey Bickle, the director, essentially the antagonist of the film, mostly so the production could save some money. Dusty Nelson was like, "Hey, do you want to do this? Do you want to act in this role?" And they're like, he was like, "I hadn't really thought about it, but yeah, I guess I can, and that'll save us from having to hire another actor." So that's what they did. And he had a background in acting. He had a theatrical background as well, although his primary focus at the time was in music. He was a composer. He actually composed the score for this film, but he was in a band where he like traveled to Japan and traveled all over the world. Like, he was that's a sort of brilliant piece of direction, because it makes Lacey come across as sort of an emotionless sociopath. Like, he is very cold. He feels like he could be right at home in like a Cronenberg movie to me, honestly.
He's definitely my favorite part of this movie.
Yeah, it's very chilling. It's a very chilling performance. He's really good, I think. It's kind of weird that he didn't do more acting. But
yeah, I in seeing him in a couple scenes where he's just kind of sitting there in a room and there's other people, but he's so relaxed and just quiet.
Yeah,
it gives,
even when propositioning a woman for sex.
Yeah, to me, it just kind of it gave his character like a sense of power and importance that kind of.
He certainly is self-important,
right?
He feels that he's important.
Yeah, but all that to say, like, it made his character more menacing, I feel like.
Yeah, self-important.
Right.
He feels that he's important.
Yeah, but all that to say, like, it made his character more menacing, I feel like.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And so what do you think's the more awkward sex proposal, this or the one from Martin, where he just says, Lacey Bickle says, "Hey, you want to have sex?" And then or Martin, who says, you just want me here for the sex. Which do you think is more awkward?
I don't know. Like, I feel like at least with Martin, he's more innocent. sounding about it. And Lacey always just sounds like, I don't care about you, but I will do you if that makes it will probably help us both out.
There should have just been like a big sigh at the beginning of it. It's just like, so you want to have sex or whatever? He's bored with humanity.
I do think that John
Humanity.
I do think that John Harrison's score for the movie is actually really good too. It's pretty minimal because they couldn't hire like an orchestra. He plays a piano a lot of times in it, and he also hired. He had a couple of friends that came in, like local musicians that helped out with the score. One guy was playing a flute and makes these like interesting flute noises. But at the end, in that chase scene where Joe Pilato's running through the woods, there's this electronic drum machine sound as the main score, and it's really cool. I think it's a really cool score. Basically, like Harrison and Nelson, they got a friend to come in who had a drum machine in 1978 was like pretty new technology, but they had a friend who had one, and they would just kind of direct him like, hey, do something like wild and crazy here, and he would just start like hitting. It's a really bizarre score at the end, but I think it ratchets up the tension a good bit. I think it adds a lot to those scenes.
Yeah, because I think
very frantic.
Yeah, I think
it adds a lot to those scenes.
Yeah, because I think
very frantic.
Yeah, I think subconsciously you kind of equate it to Dom's heartbeat, and then because you're siding with him, you kind of sympathize, and then you yourself start to feel that anxiety.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. If there's one performance in the film that goes a little bit broad, though, it's Mr. Tom Savini. And we love Mr. Tom Savini, but that's his thing. He doesn't do like subtle. He doesn't do nuance necessarily. That's not what you hire Tom Savini for. You hire Tom Savini to essentially play Tom Savini on screen. His performance in Martin is honestly probably the most like downplayed performance of his career. But I think it works in this. He's supposed to be coked up like the entire movie, right? So I think his performance works really well.
Yeah, I think so. It's
for that role.
Yeah, exactly. For that role. Yeah, works.
Tom Savini's just me.
Of course, and Tom Savini was much like John Harrison as an actor, composer / producer, actually. Tom Savini is also pulling double duty in this. He's doing not only on screen, but he's doing what he's probably most famous for, which is he's doing the makeup effects. He's doing the gore effects. And there aren't a lot of gore effects in this movie, but the ones that are typically good. Like what we expect from Savini. They're very good for a movie with a budget like this. Like, they look pretty great, and I love that they play into the meta narrative of the film, because Joe Pilato's character is a cameraman / stunt guy / effects guy, which is kind of what all the filmmakers making this movie are. They've all got different hats that they wear at different times.
Yeah, they're kind of lucky into the people they end up with. That it's kind of a neat crew to have all together at once. Like even Harris, he was like a touring musician. Like he was.
Yeah, I talked about that.
Yeah, I'm just like he was.
Yeah, I talked about that.
Yeah, I'm just saying he's whatever.
Yeah, no, you're right though. They've got there's a lot of talent on set, and guys who would go on to do even more after this. Obviously Savini, but even some of the other guys did quite a lot of work after this. So one of the limits of such a low budget like this film is that in 1978 they're shooting on film. That's a huge expense. It's very expensive, and in fact, the filmmakers estimated it on the commentary for this film when they talk about. They said the cost of the film itself, like the literal reels, is probably about half of their budget just on film. It's incredibly.
Wow.
That's one thing that people don't understand about movies like this is that film is incredibly expensive, and they're shooting on 16 millimeter. They're not shooting on 35 millimeter, which is even more expensive. They're shooting on 16 millimeter with the intention of blowing that up to 35 millimeter later. That another reason that it's so grainy is because they didn't have a lot of lights. So they're shooting with available light a lot of times, and when you don't have a lot of light, it will often come across as grainy. I think they had 3 lights on set. Like that was it. That's all that they could afford. And some of those lights appear in the movie as the lights that the crew is using. They had 2 cameras.
They get screen time.
Yeah. They had 2 cameras, and one of those is also the camera that Joe Pilato's character uses on screen. So like they're doing everything they can to be, kind of clever and stretch their budget as far as they can. But that also meant they had to be very, very careful about what they shot, about which shots they were getting. They weren't able to do a lot of takes. They weren't able to do a lot of redos on scenes. So because every time they shot, 10 minutes of film, it's costing them a lot of money. So the performers had to really be on their toes as a result. They didn't have a lot of able to do a lot of redos on scenes. So because every time they shot, 10 minutes of film, it's costing them a lot of money. So the performers had to really be on their toes as a result. They didn't have a lot of oh, hey, Dusty, can I do that again? I didn't really like that take. They had to do it pretty much right every single time. They very rarely were able to get a second take.
Well, I mean, that kind of goes back to, watching film. And if you dive into film history, you see where it was kind of like they had this stage play and then someone set up a camera and then they, decided to get different angles and all this other stuff. And then, well, we're shooting this film on location, but we got theater actors. And as that progresses, you see it transition more to nowadays. There's actually different schools. There's different methods of teaching stage acting versus film acting.
Well, sure, because in stage acting, you have to be a little, not necessarily broad. It was just a dumb accident. Basically what happened is the film's being processed and it jumps off the wheel that it's on and it ends up splitting the actual film itself down the middle. So it's completely unsalvageable.
Oh, shit.
Which forced them to have to reshoot those scenes and use more film. Well, to add insult to injury, when the lab told them that this had happened, they told them that they had actually, ruined a reel of their film. They gave them the wrong reel number. So when the crew went back to reshoot those scenes, they reshot the wrong stuff.
Oh, God damn it.
It's funny listening to the commentary where the filmmakers talk about that now, and they kind of laugh about it. But at the time that they were filming this, they were pissed. They were livid because that's expensive, man. I'm sure the lab gave them hopefully some kind of discount coupon.
Yeah. I was just thinking, I was from a
pissed.
They were
livid because that's expensive, man. I'm sure the lab gave them hopefully some kind of discount coupon.
Yeah. I was just thinking, I was from a producing standpoint, you got to be all right, let's get them to pay for something.
Yeah, and they didn't have. They're such a small crew that they didn't have a script supervisor to double check this kind of stuff.
Right.
So normally on a higher production movie, you've got 7 or 8 people who would have double checked that before they actually shot, but they didn't have that many people on the crew, so they didn't have anyone to do that.
Mm.
And they had to get creative with their use of props and costumes. They're using basically their own clothes and their own props, everything. They didn't buy hardly anything for this movie because, again, couldn't afford it, didn't have the time or the money to put into that kind of stuff. But I think that it's really interesting that because these meta elements kind of permeate the entire film, the production and the film itself, with real life about anyone getting murdered in real life. So, but this is a small crew living together in this tiny house, making a horror movie about a small crew living together in a tiny house making a horror movie. It's really fun.
Yeah.
And one of the fascinating things about this movie, as I started researching how it got made, is just how much it parallels the making of Night of the Living Dead. Because
I actually had that thought as I was watching it. I was just kind of this could have easily been about Night of the Living Dead.
Yeah, because you've got a small crew of filmmakers from Pittsburgh who had been making industrial films and commercials. They're ready to break out into feature filmmaking, so they decide the best move, the most financially stable thing to make is a low-budget horror movie. They raise a little bit of money from investors, mostly people they know. The crew moves into, many of the crew members live in a small, secluded farmhouse where they're also filming on the outskirts of Pittsburgh. And they hire local Pittsburgh actors. They don't go to on the outskirts of Pittsburgh. And they hire local Pittsburgh actors. They don't go to New York or LA to get actors. They hire local guys. Members of the crew all perform multiple roles. You've got Dusty Nelson, writer, director, cameraman. He shot most of the film. He didn't shoot everything, but he shot probably 90% of it himself. Pat Buba, producer, editor, sound engineer. John Harrison, actor, executive producer, composer. Tom Savini, special makeup effects, actor, like everyone's got multiple hats, just like they did on Night of the Living Dead, where you had, an actor who was also a producer, et cetera. Marilyn Eastman, who was an actor / makeup effects. The parallels are really interesting to me. And I know that happens a lot on small budget movies. I know it probably, we referenced Evil Dead earlier. I'm sure it happened a lot on that as well. But I think it's really fun that this movie, who has such strong connections to Romero, was made in a very similar way from his breakout movie.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it seems like that's kind of you're doing 3 things on this set or more. Yeah. And it's, it's the same folks, a lot of locals. So, yeah.
So another parallel with Night of the Living Dead is that the big truck explosion at the end of this movie, it's all once again courtesy of Regis Servinsky and his partner Tony Panatella, the same 2 guys who rigged the truck on Night. If you look in the credits for this movie, they're literally, their credit is just, it just says explosion and has their names next to it. That was their credit. Not demolitions experts or anything, just explosion. So, it's, like I said, it's a very small, very tight-knit community of filmmakers there.
Oh, yeah. Well, there's worse things to be credited as.
So I guess this is time, Gary, we discussed this last week, but we have to discuss whether we think Todd liked this movie or not. The way this conversation has gone so far, Todd liked this movie or not. The way this conversation has gone so far, I'm questioning what was originally my assessment was that Todd would not like this movie, but he hasn't been too down on it yet. So I'm trying to figure out what we think here, Gary. What do you think? Do you think Todd liked this movie? Because last week I said Todd was not going to like this movie. That was my initial thought.
I also thought Todd wouldn't like this movie, but right now it sounds like he liked it a lot more than me. So,
all right, Todd, where do you fall, Todd?
Todd does not like this movie. Yeah, sorry,
guys.
If I can offer this up, I feel about it the same way I feel about Martin. I feel like it's full of potential. I get where they were for what is a fairly short movie. I found myself, and I don't normally do this at all, checking to see how much time was left. I did that 4 times, and that's not a good sign. I feel like the script was vague. Like I said, the acting is better, and that's great. The special effects are on par, for something from Savini in the 70s. That's all good. But just overall, it took too long to get going. And by the time stuff really ramped up, it was almost over. And I was like, well,
I think that the thing is, when we're talking about movies like this, these little exploitation movies, these low budget exploitation movies or horror movies, which we'll be talking about regularly. The thing is, when we're talking about movies like this, these little exploitation movies, these low budget exploitation movies or horror movies, which we'll be talking about regularly, not every week, but these are the types of movies that will come up regularly on this podcast because they're important to the genre. You have to judge them a little bit differently than you would like a major blockbuster or even a higher budgeted horror movie, because you have to kind of, and it's not to say they necessarily get a pass, but there's a different level of what, for me, what makes me appreciate a movie like this. And it's not necessarily that it's perfect, because part of the charm of a movie like this, these little low budget movies, is that they're a little rough around the edges, that they're not perfect, but they're made by people who are passionate. And I think with a movie like this, you can see that passion on screen, even if the final result is not perfect by any means. And that result is not perfect by any means. And that's kind of what makes movies like this special. And there are some exploitation movies that fall into that category that are unwatchable. And this movie is not. This movie is pretty fascinating, even if there are times where it is paced poorly, and it's not always paced poorly. I just think, like you said, it does. There are scenes where it becomes a hangout movie where it's just, but I like those scenes where they're hanging out. Like, I think those are fun. I think the scene where Joe Pilato is hanging out with the crew and they're doing coke, like, I think that's a really fun scene.
I think the thing is, though, is like you're talking, I mean, all those things you're saying are true. And I mean, I think it's possible that you can appreciate that this movie exists. I can appreciate a lot of people's desire to make music. That doesn't mean they make good music or should be rock stars, you know. And I'm not saying that like Tom Savini shouldn't be a rock star. I'm just saying
Tom Savini is a rock star.
I know. I'm not saying he shouldn't be.
That's totally.
I think he can appreciate that it exists. I think I appreciate that this movie exists, and I think, but I literally think that the only reason that I can appreciate it exists is that it's like knowing this background and the connection it has to George Romero's legacy and this group of people. I don't think that this movie is. I think it's interesting to super fans of the genre. I don't think it'll be that interesting to anybody else.
And let me just add for a second that, and I pointed out a couple of good points, but to just reiterate, I do think there are some really great parts of this movie. And like Justin said, it does become a hangout movie in some parts. And I know that it is still a short movie, but I think for this concept and the things that they had to work with, I think in editing, if they had tightened it down to a short film, but like a 40-minute short film, I think this would have been awesome. Really,
I think some stuff's really, really super effective in this movie. There are scenes that really work. I mean,
it's an incredibly meta movie, and it's very
very
ahead of its time in that way.
Because I think the idea is good. It just I don't think the execution works.
Because it's about a group of people it's made by a group of people who are basically living the life that they're depicting on screen. Right. And it's meta in ways that don't necessarily jump out at you immediately until the end of the film. Like you've got Joe Pilato, the one of the biggest scenes in the movie that I think reads a lot into the meaning of the film or what they're trying to say is that scene where Joe Pilato and the other crew members are doing coke and hanging out and they're talking about movies. And he says that that you should care about the people that, you know, he's trying to argue that you should care about the people. If you're going to kill them, you need to get to know them and care about them so that you care if they die. And the other guys are kind of like, nah, people just want to see like heads getting lobbed off. But that very scene is you getting to know his character. They're getting you to care about Joe Pilato's character because he is a very sympathetic character. Like he's a very likable character. And he
is the only one that I think you could argue that for, because what I was about to say
he's really the only one you're supposed to.
Like you don't get either of those things too much. Like Pilato's fine with, it's like you're like, okay, I get he's the only person in this whole entire movie that acts decent at any point.
Yeah, I mean he's the only one
That's the only reason you care for him. Not because you care about him. You're just like, well, he seems like an all right guy.
He's a blue collar guy, you know, living paycheck to paycheck, and he got duped into doing this movie where he did not know that he was going to be the main subject, essentially. But considering the budget that he had, it's a shame that I think he didn't go on to do bigger budget horror movies, because I think he really could have stretched his skills later on. But I do think he does a good job of building suspense when it's needed. You know, like that. I think the chase scene which is another thing that gets referenced in the coke scene, because Joe Pilato's like, you need a big chase scene at the end. That's the one thing your movie is missing. And then they put a big chase scene at the end of this movie, and he is the prey. Like, I think that's really fun. That's a really fun idea. And I think that scene is done really, really well with the music that we were talking about earlier, the way the music works and the way that they shot it in that like wide angle where it just makes everything look really threatening. Like the woods look threatening.
See, man, I was into that, but I thought it went on way too long. Like I lost all sense of suspense. Like in that movie. Yeah, I was just like, I'm not feeling this. Like at first, when it finally starts going down, you're like, oh, this is kind of out of nowhere. It's happening. It's like, I feel like all going into it, you're like, this is going to happen at some point. And then it does, and it happens. It kind of catches you off guard, like when it starts. But then it just feels like, I don't know, something about there are parts of it that really work, but it feels like it lasts like a half hour, and it's like it's not. it just after, I don't know, by the time it even gets into the house where he's fighting that guy and stuff, all of it, the way it's done, I'm just kind of like, it felt pretty uneventful. I wasn't into it.
I mean, I got really invested in that because, again, I really like his character, but I do think, I mean, I don't agree that it goes on too long. It doesn't go on very long. But there's something about this movie that I don't know, there's something really charming about the way that it feels. Like you can almost see the scene on the film, and there's something about that appeals to me on a low budget movie like this, a little exploitation movie like this. I like that I can sense it being made. And I also like that I feel like the scenes where, like, I keep going back to that one scene, but like the scene where they're doing coke and they're talking about movies that they like. They're talking about The Omen and The Fury and Night of the Living Dead. Like, I feel like that's probably something that happened on the set of Martin or on the set of Night of the Living Dead, filmmakers hanging out, or even on the set of this movie.
Gary, you realize this is Justin trying to tell us that he's doing coke. And he's doing a lot of coke. He's
well, what
really
I was
trying
going
to
to say
justify
was that
doing
this,
coke.
you and your wife all the time talk about like the stuff you liked on Psychotronic, and like I feel like our dichotomy or whatever, like our coupling here, this is exactly that thing at play here. Like, yeah, I get that you would like it. I exactly like you are going to like it. Not exactly like you, but I mean like people that are invested in who these people are in real life. And like just love the idea that they're making a movie, and this is one of the early chances you can see. So you get to see like the trappings and the things they succeeded at, things they might have failed at, that sort of thing. But for a casual audience, especially, even horror fans, the movie. I mean, there's something to like expectation. I mean, the movie's presented sort of like it's going to be a slasher, and it's certainly not that.
Oh no, I mean it's barely a horror movie. It's It has horror elements, but it's not what I would consider like a particularly scary movie.
But likely the people that are going to stumble on it are going to be horror movie fans. And I think that like most people, it's just my opinion, obviously, but I feel like a lot of people would be disappointed by this movie.
I think the meta narrative of it, like the way that it keeps kind of, you don't.
I mean, obviously, but I feel like a lot of people would be disappointed by this movie.
I think the meta narrative of it, like the way that it keeps kind of, you don't really, it keeps tricking you. Like you're watching the movie, then you're watching the movie within the movie, and then you're watching this secret movie that's being made. Like it goes all over the place. And at first it's very disorienting in a very intentional way, I think.
I don't think it ever finds its way back, personally. That's another thing about it for me. Like, I think by the end of the movie, I was just kind of like, wow, you really have to work hard for this to make sense. Like that this all played out this way.
I mean, it makes sense.
It feels real muddled to me. I mean, that's personally, and maybe I'm an idiot. Maybe I just didn't get it.
That probably has something to do with it.
But I watched it, and for dumb me, then by the end of it, when they're sitting in the truck that's about to explode, I was like, "What the fuck, really?" I was like, "You just had to end it." This is
my backup plan, is that I got to just kill him. The thing is, like, Celeste is in on it partially. A lot of people on set they're in on the fact that Lacey's secretly making a snuff film, but not everyone knows, and not everyone knows every element of it. Like Celeste knows some elements of it, but she doesn't know everything. She even doesn't believe that Dom, Joe Pilato's character, is going to truly get hurt, because when they start shooting him, she's like, you guys said you wouldn't hurt him. So even she's not in on everything. I think the only person that knows everything is maybe Tom Savini and John Harrison's characters. And I like the way that they introduce Tom Savini, by the way. Like they introduce him in that bar scene, which is another really fun scene, another fun hangout scene that lets you know the characters, but he comes across as just this asshole. And then he shows up on set like the next day, and you kind of at first think maybe he's just Lacey's like coke dealer or something. But you kind of find out that, oh no, he's working on or something. But you kind of find out that, oh no, he's working on this secret movie that they're filming. Which, by the way, I think that reveal of the underground like media station, which they filmed at an actual TV station, like something like an hour and a half away from the house they were filming at. It feels like that might have been direct influence on Cabin in the Woods.
Yeah, I could see that.
Yeah. I was trying to draw some comparisons of like what movies were clearly, or maybe not clearly, but could have potentially been influenced by this movie.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Cabin in the Woods,
or at least similar ideas.
A little bit of a New Nightmare, to a degree, even Truman Show a little bit.
Sure.
But yeah.
So going back to the horror element, the one scene in the film that is very clearly horror, that is very clearly
the most effective scene in the movie.
It absolutely is. It is disturbing. It like truly disturbing to watch. Like there's no score. You're just watching it play out and you don't know what's going on. And the way it's shot in like the super grainy black and white, the way that the guy, the hooded figure bumps the camera at one point, it kind of goes skewed. It's really well done. And I don't know this for sure, but I think that was maybe Tom Savini. Because
I was thinking it was probably
he's holding
Tom
a
Savini.
knife. The guy, the knife that he used to kill the girl, you see Tom Savini with a couple scenes earlier.
Yeah.
When they're around the campfire and Celeste like runs off and he has that knife and he's like whittling or something and stabs it into the ground to go chase her down, but it's the exact same knife, which they never allude to in the film, but I thought that was a fun little touch. But that scene is like it feels almost like it reminded me of like the feeling of the video that you see in The Ring, the way which they never allude to in the film, but I thought that was a fun little touch. But that scene is like it feels almost like it reminded me of like the feeling of the video that you see in The Ring, the way it's shot, like very grainy and just like you can't quite see what's going on, but it's enough to like really fuck with your head.
It's definitely my favorite part of the movie. In that, I mean, it's effective. Like I was uncomfortable watching it. Like you could believe you were watching a snuff film. Like it was done really, really well.
Really well done.
Even the way the woman is portrayed or her job acting in the scene and stuff. It looks uncomfortable and icky and like something's really happening to this person. That one gave me chills. So I give it 100% props there.
It kind of reminded me of what to me was the most effective scene in, if you guys recall that Nick Cage movie, 8mm, where he's watching the movie, but the camera's tight on him. Even some of that's in the trailer for it. And it's
a really underrated movie.
Yeah, it's very effective. It's very effective.
So Effects ended up having its world premiere at the King's Court Theater on November 9th, 1979. Following that premiere, the film was signed to distribution with a company called International Harmony. And the film played a few film festivals, including the Sundance Film Festival, believe it or not. It wasn't called Sundance at the time. It actually changed its name the next year. It was at the time just called the U.S. Film Festival, but it was the same thing. And according to Dusty Nelson on the commentary for this film, Sundance audiences did not enjoy the movie. So especially the scene, the scene we were just talking about, the snuff film that's within the movie.
Right.
And unfortunately, the movie never really got a release after that. I couldn't find any details as to what happened. Even in the commentary and the behind the scenes stuff that's on the Blu-ray, like nobody ever gives any details. The filmmakers just refer to it as a bad deal or a bad distribution deal. But whatever happened, it caused the movie to basically be lost for about 25 years. Never got a theatrical release outside of those few festival screenings.
Yeah, I was going to say, I tried really looking into that, and the best I could find was this guy, Stuart Shapiro, was a distributor, and he was like a specialist in music, horror, and cult films. But one of the things he was a distributor for, like back in the day, was which I thought was relevant, was the Psychotronic Man. And he gave
another lost film that only like had one theatrical screening, I think.
Yeah, so he was apparently terrible in his job. But he but what was interesting about him is that besides that connection to us, is that also he gave it like a limited theatrical release in 80. It said, through International Harmony, but he also ran a video company called Harmony Vision, and he was the creator of the late night series Night Flight. And but yeah, he gave it like that limited bit, and it returned to King's Court apparently in like October of 1980, and then that was like the last time it was screened.
Yeah, and until 2004 or so, and Synapse Films basically rescued it. Synapse Films, known for distributing lesser known horror movies and lost horror movies, things like that. They do a lot of really fun exploitation and cult movies. They discovered it. They released it. This film had been known throughout like the horror circuit because of the people involved, because of what they went on to do later on. So people knew of this movie, but very few people had actually seen it until 2004 when Synapse released their DVD. And then 2018, I think it was, AGFA, the American Genre Film Archive, released it on Blu-ray, which is what I watched it on. And it's a really good copy. I think it was AGFA, the American Genre Film Archive, released it on Blu-ray, which is what I watched it on. And it's a really good copy. I mean, it's still a scratched up, 16 millimeter movie, so it's only going to look so good, but it looks about as good as it could. And they actually, speaking with the filmmakers and stuff, AGFA discovered that they had the only existing 35 millimeter print of the film in their archives, because the print that was used for the Synapse DVD back in 2004 had been damaged over the years. So AGFA ended up they found out that they had the only existing print, which is what AGFA does. Like, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the American Genre Film Archive, but they basically are digitizing these movies that might otherwise be lost forever to history. Like, they're rescuing these lost, usually movies that you've only heard of if you're like very deep into like exploitation movies and old cult movies, sometimes giving their first video release. But they digitize them so that they will last, because film will eventually deteriorate. Yeah. So they digitize them so that they'll be available for generations to come to watch, which I think is really cool. And I think they're doing really great work. And and so I highly recommend supporting them. They do some really fun sounding movies.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you sent us the link for where we could, pick up a copy of effects. And I just took it as an opportunity to just browse, and it's pretty wild, like some of the stuff they have.
There's some pretty wild movies on there.
It kind of reminded me of like walking through the video aisles, when I was a kid, of just seeing just these bonkers titles.
AGFA does great like cover art and everything for them, so very eye-catching. It's really cool.
Yeah, it's fun.
Yeah, so I'm glad they exist, and I'm glad that this movie was made. So I don't want to feel like
it's fun.
Yeah. So I'm glad they exist, and I'm glad that this movie was made. So I don't want to feel like I'm just completely shitting on it. So I want to be clear. Like, I mean, I appreciate that the movie is there. I watched it twice this week, but my thing is like, that'll probably be the last time, like at least for a long, long time, that I bother with it. It didn't do it for me in whole. And I tried to watch it a second time because I knew that I would be disagreeing with one, perhaps both of you. And so I was like, maybe I was in the wrong place. And I went back through it this morning, and I was just still kind of like, I don't know, man, sluggish. Some of the stuff just doesn't do it. There's some really effective scenes in it.
But you can definitely see, I think, the talent of those involved.
Yeah, I mean, everybody's
they're very limited on what they could do with such a small budget. But
super cult favorite.
I mean, it's not that kind of movie, but for people who are into the history of the genre, I think it's a good one to watch. I think it's a good one to check out. I mean, it's pretty easily available as well. It's on several streaming services as of the time we're recording this, including Shudder, and I think it's on Tubi TV. It's on a few different places. So very easy to find now, which is ironic considering it was lost for a quarter of a century. So as far as the futures of all of those involved, we already know about Savini. We already know where Savini went after this. We're going to be talking about that for the next several weeks. Director Dusty Nelson, unfortunately, doesn't have a whole lot of credits after this. Like, I went on his website even. He's got done some commercial work and things like that. And I think he's still working within the industry, just not working on like TV or film. So you don't find a lot of credits. Like on his IMDb, his only directing credits after this include he did one episode of the George Romero created TV series Tales from the Dark Side. He did two different ninja after this include he did one episode of the George Romero created TV series Tales from the Dark Side. He did two different ninja movies in 1987. And he did a horror movie called Necromancer in 1988. And then he didn't do anything else until 2002, a movie called Inferno. And he doesn't have any credits past that time. So I don't know what he's doing these days. The other members of ImageWorks teams, they had a slightly more prestigious careers. Pat Buba spent the majority of his career as an editor. He unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago. But he worked with George Romero on Night Riders, on Creep Show, Day of the Dead, Monkey Shine's Two Evil Eyes, and The Dark Half, among other things, including he was one of the editors of Michael Mann's Heat. So, like,
wow,
yeah, pretty big career.
Well, he became buddied up with Al Pacino. I was seeing in like in Pacino's directorial debut, Looking for Richard. He did that.
Mm-hmm. His final
Wild Salome, I think.
Salome was his last credit. I think that was 2013, and that was his last movie that he did before he passed away, which is a Pacino film. John Harrison probably had the biggest career of all of them. He worked on the Tales of the Dark Side TV show as well, directed like 8 episodes of that one. Then it went on to direct the Tales from the Dark Side movie, which was a pretty fun horror anthology film from 1990.
Produced by Richard Rubenstein, if we haven't mentioned that. But
yeah, Rubenstein and Romero.
Yeah.
So, but he mostly directed television. Probably most well known for the Frank Herbert's Dune miniseries from 2000 that came on. I think it was on the Sci-Fi Channel, but don't quote me on that. But he also directed 3 episodes of the new Creep Show TV series that was released on Shudder last year. So he's still kind of working on Romero-themed or Romero-adjacent works even now, which Tom Savini also directed an episode of. He also directed 3 episodes of the new Creep Show TV series that was released on Shudder last year. So he's still kind of working on Romero-themed or Romero-adjacent works even now, which Tom Savini also directed an episode of that series. But as a composer, he did scores for Romero's Creep Show. He did Day of the Dead. So he still did a lot of work as a composer as well, and still is working to this day, as far as I'm aware.
He just had a miniseries come out on Netflix. Well, I guess it's a few years ago now, but Residue was the name of it. It was like
that he directed or composed.
That he wrote. He created and wrote it. Yeah.
He also wrote the movie Dinosaur, the Disney movie from like the early 2000s. Remember that?
Oh, yeah.
Like CGI, it was like all CGI dinosaur.
Oh yeah.
He wrote. He was one of the writers on that. So yeah. So next week. So this episode was kind of a little side quest, I guess you could say, on the film, and it on this journey through Romero and Savini's career, because like it was a movie that he'd been working on. And it was finally released in 1981. It's a movie that I've actually been wanting to visit for years, and I've never seen. So I'm finally going to sit down and watch it for this podcast. From 1981, it's a movie called Night Riders, which also, once again, stars as on screen as an actor, Tom Savini himself.
Nice.
Yeah.
Have you guys seen Night Riders?
I've never seen it. No.
So none of us have seen it.
Yeah.
Heard of it, but
yeah.
This will be interesting because I think Pat Buba, like, you mentioned it. He edited
the editor,
with Romero. That's the first time Romero gave up editing or like shared it. I think he ends up giving it up to him by Day of the Dead. But so it's interesting to see. Is like you'll see his evolving. But did we? I do want to say, like, I really do like Pilato and Joseph Pilato. Like, I think he's a really good guy. And I'm sorry if you said this, but he just died like this. I do want to say, like, I really do like Pilato and Joseph Pilato. Like, I think he's a really good guy. And I'm sorry if you said this, but he just died like this past year.
Last year, last March.
And so we'll get to his like most famous role, obviously, is Captain Rhodes. But
yes, of course.
But he's a good actor. I really like him, and I ended up going down a rabbit hole of reading about him this time, just because I was like, it's cool seeing him up front and center here. And, he would like end up rounding out his career, like doing like Harry Cooper from Night of the Living Dead on the Origins movie that came out, that Origins 3D movie.
Oh, did he? Is he in that?
Yeah. Well, he I mean, I think it's all computer animated, but he has the voice for Harry Cooper. Yeah. Wow. But he had a really cool thing, a quote I saw, because he ended up, I started reading about, and he was telling the story in one of the interviews I saw where it happened because he was originally slated God, I wish I could remember the name of the person. Whoever came up with Dusk Till Dawn originally. Like there were
Rodriguez.
But it wasn't Rodriguez. I was really surprised by this. It was somebody else had it, and it was because of a script from Quentin Tarantino, and it was before Quentin Tarantino knew anyone. And you can find this online. They shot a teaser commercial thing for it, like a trailer.
So somebody else that was going to direct it.
Yeah, somebody else was going to direct it, and I'm, God, I wish I could remember who it was. It's somebody you'd know. And they had it, and they cast Joseph Pilato as the George Clooney character was one of the Gecko brothers, and the trailer is of him playing that role. Like, I mean, it's just like him locked away, like downstairs in the basement, when the vampires are trying to get. And the trailer is of him playing that role. Like, I mean, it's just like him locked away, like downstairs in the basement, when the vampires are trying to get in. And he was supposed to take that role, and then he tells a story about how then Reservoir Dogs happened, and then that blew up, and people wanted Quentin Tarantino and anything connected to Quentin Tarantino, and then that thing started blowing up, and then he wasn't big enough to be a star there, so George Clooney became the star of that movie, and he ended up getting a role somehow through all of that, just as a nice gift, as Dean Martin in Pulp Fiction. And he had this quote I was reading, and it says, "There's an old saying in Hollywood, an actor walks into a studio lot, he takes a left, he gets run over by craft services truck. Turns right, he bumps into a casting director who says, 'You're the guy we've been looking for.'"
More come Day of the Dead in a few weeks. So
I thought it was worth mentioning since he is the likable person in all of this.
Yes, of course. Yeah. Yes. Man, I just looked up this Night of the Living Dead thing you talked about. It's only got a 3.9 on IMDb, so I'm not terribly jazzed about it, but I might have to watch it because, one, it's only an hour long, but two,
Danielle Harris is in it.
Danielle Harris and Bill Moseley and Tony Todd are all in it.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And Tom Sizemore. It's got some good people involved. So I don't know. Maybe I'll watch it. Who knows? Maybe.
Yeah, I kept telling myself I'd watch it, but then you have to. I don't know. You have to bring yourself to do it. So
you have to watch it. Luckily, it's only an hour long, so that might help.
I don't know. I just found, I guess, whoever I thought, it's on Robert Rodriguez HD. Like, you can find that trailer from Dusk Till Dawn with Joe Pilato as Seth Gecko. But the trailer was directed by maybe Rodriguez was always tied to it somehow. But it's interesting.
I'm sure we'll do an episode on that movie at some point down the line, and we'll talk about it. Well, thank you guys for coming. I think we're done talking about this movie.
Thanks for having.
And the coming part.
Yes.
Listen,
or both.
I always come on the podcast.
Oh, thank you, Todd. Writer, comedian Todd Davis. If you want more,
book now.
If you want great content like that 24 hours a day, please follow Todd at Mr. Todd A. Davis on Twitter and Instagram. His Instagram is mostly pictures of his own face after he gets a haircut, or pictures of what he had for brunch this week.
And my dog.
And Max. I mean, honestly, Max is the A+ content on Todd's Instagram feed. Gary is at This Is Gary Horn on what he had for brunch this week.
And my dog.
And Max. I mean, honestly, Max is the A+ content on Todd's Instagram feed. Gary is at This Is Gary Horn on all the places, including Letterboxd. We're all on Letterboxd, we should say, if you want to follow us. I don't know how regularly you guys are using them. I think Gary's keeping up pretty well.
Yeah. I've fallen behind. I actually need to go and update some stuff. So
I just called back up yesterday with anything I had forgotten.
Nice. And I am at Justin_Bishop in all those same places. Follow the show at various accounts. Cinema _shock on Twitter and Instagram, I believe. And then Cinema Shock Net on Facebook.
Yep.
You can also find all of our links on cinemashock.net or just in the show description on this episode. You can also find links on our website to where you can watch the movies we're talking about every week and et cetera. Have I forgotten anything?
I'm at This Is Gary Horn. Did you say that?
I sure did.
All right.
You should listen to me more when we're talking.
I'm sorry, my wife is texting me right now that her car isn't starting and she's stuck. So I have.
All right, well, go rescue her. We're done. Until next week.
May the wings of liberty never lose a feather.
Be excellent to each other.
Johnny has the keys.
No, Todd.
Yep.
I hate it.
Oh,
Until you figure out what I'm saying.
why do we have?
That's what it is.
We all figured out our own.
Yeah,
well,
I figured out mine, motherfuckers.
Right,
it's bad though.
Do I have to write a piece about why I say Johnny has the keys?
If you could write a compelling argument, but I don't know how that's a send off at all. I mean, even from that movie, you could pick others.
Maybe we'll be back next week with a better one.
With or without Todd.
All right.